That's given us a wonderful overview of so many different themes of roughly 100 years ago or even before that. You mentioned something there in 2006. I remember that was the 90th anniversary of the Rising. And what had happened then was that two BBC people came over to make a radio documentary on 1916, and we were in Kilmainham. And I realised that they were very, very moved by the whole thing, and it got me thinking, we don't seem to be as moved as by this as they are. And these were the stiff upper lip BBC people. And, when you're in somewhere like the Stonebreakers Yard, you'll appreciate this, Pat, obviously, given the time you were in Kilmainham, not for a crime, obviously, but for reasons of different reasons. But it did get you thinking. Sometimes you have to strip things back to the basics. What was this all about? What were they prepared to do? And sacrifices that might have been made. And it is a moving experience still, and should be, I suppose. But you mentioned also, Regina, this question of globalisation and taking ownership in. We often hear this now, Pat. A globalised world, and we're the most globalised country anywhere. When you think of freedom or defining freedom now, how conscious are you of that globalisation, and where does Ireland fit in?
Well, being somebody that's actually married to a Tamil Indian from Malaysia, one is constantly conscious that the ground upon which we now discuss Irishness is no longer a homogeneous ground. It's a hybridized ground of some kind or another. So talking or addressing this question for the contemporary moment, I think you very eloquently alluded to it, Fiach. It's a more complicated world now. Who are the we in Irishness now has no simple essentialized answer, in a way that it had a kind of a homogeneous answer, potentially up until the 1990s? Things changed so rapidly in this country. I remember when I used to walk into a pub with my fiancée, I suppose as you would describe it then, in the 80s. It was like one of those scenes from a Western when the guy walks through the swing doors and, the music stops and people stop drinking and look. I mean, a coloured person was actually an event back at that stage. We have changed so much and so rapidly. But if I can just, because I'm a kind of a material historian, I'd like to come at this question of freedom and do a little bit of backfilling on it, if you don't mind, before answering the question of where are we with it now. So for over 25 years, I had a hands-on relationship with probably the best collection of nationalist and Republican memorabilia in this country. It was a tremendous honour to have that level of intimacy with it in both the Pearse Museum collection and, of course, the great Kilmainham Jail collection. So my thoughts will be developed along that material culture line. There was an object in that collection which always struck me as being one of the most haunting ones in a way, and it was an image from the weekly Freedom of 1888, at the height of the Planet campaign, and it depicted John Dillon in bed, in jail in Dundalk. And the caption underneath it was, "John Dillon's body is lying in Dundalk jail tonight, but his soul goes marching on." And his ignominious felon's uniform with the arrows on it was kind of hooked over the end of the bed, and he was apparently sound asleep, but no, he wasn't. It was a light sleep, because on the jail wall behind him, there was a dream cloud. And in the dream cloud, there was Dillon himself, with a flag and Home Rule emblazoned on it, leading England on one flag, Scotland on another, and Wales on another flag. So that was a kind of a dream of freedom, but it was just a kind of rudimentary set of labels recently, really. But I think the most important thing about this to remember is that for virtually every single person who was engaged with politics in the 19th century, freedom was really a matter of its absence or its denial. And this, for the politician, there was a credential that virtually every politician had to have in the 19th century, and right up to the moment of independence, which was a jail record. If you didn't have a jail record, you were not really a credible Irish politician. Be you a moderate nationalist. Remember, all of the Irish Parliamentary Party was in Kilmainham Jail in 1881. It was more than their political careers was worth not to join their leader, Parnell, in there by transgressing the Coercion Act at that time. And it was kind of that whole tradition of summing up tradition through freedom through bondage. The most powerful way we had of imagining it was through the fetters idea. Countess Markievicz, when she was selected as a candidate to run in the 1918 general election, she had the great good fortune at that moment to be a prisoner in Holloway Jail. And she wrote to somebody at the time, quote, "My present address alone would make an excellent election address. Sending you to jail is like pulling out all the loud stops and all the speeches you ever made. Our arrests carry so much further than our speeches." And on the other side of it then, when people went about conceptualizing freedom, let's have a look at what Pearce had to say. In Ghosts, Pearce wrote, "Like a divine religion, national freedom bears the marks of unity, of sanctity, of Catholicity, of apostolic succession. A nation's fundamental idea of freedom is not affected by the accidents of time and circumstance. It does not vary with the centuries or with the comings and goings of men or empires. The substance of truth does not change, nor does the substance of freedom." The way he talks about substance there, you could almost reach out and touch it, but what is this thing? And then in a sentence a little further on he says, "To be concrete, if we today are fighting for something either greater than or less than the thing our fathers fought for, either our fathers did not fight for freedom at all, or we are not fighting for freedom." Now, if that's concrete, I think we have still a long way to go at this stage. And it's no wonder that somebody like Todd Andrews, a kind of disillusioned realist, when he came to writing his autobiography, would say, "Our Ireland was an Ireland which had nothing to do with economics, property, or with how people lived or loved or prayed. It had in fact become a political abstraction." And as you, Jim, had just referred to, Charles Townsend, one of his summary reflections is, "Republicanism for most of its adherents was about achieving separation, sovereign independence, rather than implementing any concrete again, political programme. It was the absence of concreteness that constitutes the idea of freedom. In fact, one might almost more accurately describe it as the notion of freedom, a kind of promissory note written on the future." And in the separatist idea written in 1916, Pearce, summed up Tone's teachings in a series of 4 propositions, one of which was, "Freedom denotes separation and sovereignty." Now that's interesting, because what he's saying is, in a sense, the next iteration of freedom is this notion of sovereignty. And then, of course, we come to that famous phrase of Collins's, the pragmatist, in 22, what have we got? The freedom to achieve freedom. We have this incremental position defined. And in a sense, in a way, again, you alluded to last night, Dermot, no mean achievement over the first 30-odd years of independence were these very deft series of incremental moves to establish a degree, not necessarily of freedom within Ireland, but of sovereignty for us. The Statute of Westminster in 1931, the getting back of the treaty ports in 1938, a tremendous achievement, and the insistence on Ireland having a separate place in a great world conflagration between 1939 and 1945. These are not mean achievements. These are substantive, concrete achievements of a measure of sovereignty. I want to move on a little bit now to talk about our great period of the Celtic Tiger and my experience of that in Kilmainham Jail for a moment. And you'll see where I'm going in a minute. There's a statue of a pikeman in a place called Druids Glen. It's one of Ireland's most prestigious golf courses. And if any of you here play golf, I play a little bit for my sins, down in County Wicklow. And in the foyer to that very, exclusive golf course, there's a little lecture on Irish history. And there's a reference to the statelet of Ireland. So it's got its republicanism written on its sleeve. But one of the most distinguished members of that club is a man you'll all know. His name is Sean Fitzpatrick. He's a very keen golfer as well. And you might also recollect that recently Druids Glen has been in the news because there was a very famous game of golf play there in 2008 that involved our then Taoiseach, Brian Cowan, and three other, I think Fintan Drury was another one of the people involved. But apparently there was no, and Sean Fitzpatrick, of course. In this 4-ball, there wasn't a single reference to the condition of Anglo-Irish banks at the time, or so we're led to believe.
And there were no women there either,
not a single one. But what I want to talk about here is what I call the phenomenon of Republican chic. That's my phrase for it that grew up during this period. When I moved into Kilmainham Jail, there was the most extraordinary collection of stuff that had been basically donated, free gratis, by people walking in and saying, I want you to have this. An original proclamation or whatever it might be, because it was perceived to be a patriotic gesture of generosity. But as the 90s went on and we moved into prosperity, the donations to Kilmainham Jail of this material literally dried up. What was happening instead was the burgeoning plutocrats of our nation, among whom the property developers loomed rather large, were actually driving the prices for this material so high that there was a booming market for Republican memorabilia. I remember meeting a fellow from the West in 2002 who wanted me to assure him that the flag that he was now proposing to buy for some absolutely astronomical figure was actually the original tricolour that flew over the GPO in 1916. Happily, I was in no position to offer him any such assurance. And about 2 years later, in about 2004, I was at a wedding and I ended up at a reception in a very lavishly appointed set of apartments, which I discovered then and there was owned by one of our great property developers. And after about 3 glasses of champagne, I found myself staring into the stony eye of Nelson's decapitated head. It was the head from the Nelson's pillar that had been blown up. And this was a central icon presented here, along with another sprinkling of Republican memorabilia.
Jeez, you moved in interesting circles in the Celtic Tiger days.
I can tell you stuff that I can't say here. But I was really fascinated at this. And then I was noting things like, our great Republican tent-dwelling developers buying up things like the Savoy in London and buying into Manchester United and all of this. In other words, the colony was striking back. And here's the underlying story in a way. The Republic, the freedoms that had been promised in 1916, these were the men who were delivering on that promise through this boom of economic prosperity. They were asserting our republic to its fullest extent. So if you stop the clock in 2008 and try to imagine that we didn't fall off a cliff, and try to imagine the reviewing stand next year outside the GPO, I bet you there'd be a fair sprinkling of the people from the Galway tent sitting up there beside, no doubt, the Republican Party would still be in power at this stage. Why would they not be if things had gone on as the way they had? And people like Johnny Ronan would be sitting there as well, taking the salute. Because these are the real patriots of this country, aren't they? These are the people who made our country. But it was not to be, was it? We had that little crash in 2008. And then everything changed and changed utterly yet again to, again, tiresomely misquote Yeats on all of this. And then the question became not so much a question of freedom as a question of sovereignty. That's the main word. I actually Googled this just last night, worrying about what I was going to say here today, because I hadn't much time to compose my thoughts in advance. And I got 4,800 and something hits for the word sovereignty on the Irish Times site for 2007 to 2015. So clearly there's an underlying kind of worry or obsession, more around the word sovereignty than there is around this. An MRBI poll in 2010 revealed that 56% of Irish people believed we had lost our sovereignty with the arrival of the Troika. Very key moment. And in his State of the Nation address in December 2011, Taoiseach Enda Kenny said he wanted to be the person who retrieves Ireland's economic sovereignty. But back then, the trauma of what was going on was probably best summed up in an Irish Times editorial in November 2011. Was it for this, was the title, that the wild geese spread the grey wing, I suppose, on every tide. Quote, Irish history makes the loss... Sorry, I have it written down better here, yeah. The desire to be a sovereign people runs like a seam through all the struggles of the last 200 years. The true ignominy of our current situation is not that our sovereignty has been taken away from us, it is that we ourselves have squandered it. Now, I love that use of that, echoing the word we ourselves. Sinn Féin. You see, the thing about sovereignty is we can't really blame anybody other than ourselves. We're trapped now in this historic moment in time, reckoning with the consequences of our own indigenous political actions. That's what makes it tougher. We don't really have the British as an alibi for this any longer. Donal O'Kelly staged a rework proclamation in Arbour Hill on the 25th of April 2011. And here's just one line from that. We declare the right of senior bondholders to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies to be sovereign and indefeasible. So where are we at right now then, to get back to this thing? The freedom to achieve freedom became the freedom to achieve a measure of sovereignty. Now, a small nation state like this is never probably, if we're realistic about it, going to have absolute sovereignty. But the measures of sovereignty that we had achieved over those years were important measures. And independent-minded thinkers throughout have always been, say, have a care for that. Raymond Crotty, a name I'd like to invoke here, a farmer from County Kilkenny, largely self-educated, degree in economics from the London School of Economics, in 1991 quotes, "The state, its credit exhausted and encumbered with a debt that, relative to GNP, is the most costly in the world to service, is ineffective. The ineffectiveness is reflected in disarray in politics and corruption in public affairs. Most clearly, the state's ineffectiveness is manifested in the acceptance that only a reopening of the floodgates of immigration can relieve a desperate unemployment situation." He could have written that in 2010. We didn't have people, siren voices we needed, warning about sovereignty. So we're talking about reconstructing sovereignty, I think, at this stage. And it's going to be a slow, incremental process.
Thanks, Pat.